Thank you for the kind words, for the invitation to speak. It's something close to my heart to speak about mission approaches, and as Providence always has it, as God guides things. I'm doing a series on Philippians a series on Philippians, and we just had the last sermon, Philippians 2, 17 to 30, and this was before I really looked at the speech to write it, but it came back in a nice way where Paul says he's being poured out as a drink offering for the sake of the congregation. He's going to send Timothy, a man who is of proven character, genuinely concerned for the welfare of the church, and then Epaphroditus is sent. He's sent back home because he was homesick and he was worried about how things were. And then you see all the levels of service. You see cooperation of God's servants for the well-being of the church. And the challenge with this passage is to explain, what does that matter? All this history of who went where and who was sent and did what. It's nicer just to have it clearly Jesus is king or Jesus was born. But in thinking about that, it was very clear that that is revelation, one-time events that happen, just as significant for the church today as his birth or as Pentecost. Every step that is being taken as Paul goes out, a servant of Christ, is Jesus Christ going out. And it's fundamental because the whole church is standing in front of the whole world. And I want that to be understood, that when we're talking about missions, we're talking about the church, Jesus Christ doing his work through the church, we as a part of that, being a part of that picture, and Jesus Christ continuing to do things. And so we should look very closely at what what the apostles were doing, what they were doing. And I'm not going to go into that a whole bunch, just as a principle, a guiding principle when we do this. So this speech is really based on experience as we see it related to the churches in their cooperation. The basic point here, what we see in Scripture is that cooperation between the churches right from the beginning focuses on assistance with personnel, with people, with finances, also the focus on the character of the workers who give assistance. When we talked about a title for the general idea of the speech, I suggested cooperative missionaries, because the character of the missionary makes all the difference for the nature of the work. We went with cooperative mission approaches because that incorporates both aspects of the worker and the churches behind it. So I would have as a theses that cooperation is best served by workers of proven character who respect the congregations in which they serve. The point is that we serve the churches best when we understand where they're at, when we respect the people we're working with. So that happens on a local setting. And now we want to see the church in its breadth. See the world as the field, and then we as churches are little parts of that. So just like you think of your own church congregation as the body of Christ and everyone's a part of it, now make that building the world, and now we as churches are in that, and what we need to do is to fill in the missing spots. That's really the principle, the guiding principle that I want to think about. If you look at the very end of Philippians 2, it says, talking about Epaphroditus, who was sent to deliver money, give support to Paul, minister to him in prison in Rome. It says in Philippians 2, verse 34, so receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, the principle, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So the obligation of the congregation was to take care of Paul. Not everybody could go. Epaphroditus was chosen to go. He almost died in doing that. But that's described by our Lord Jesus Christ in the mission of the church as completing what is lacking in your service. So if I am here and there's a hole there, I'm responsible for that hole. Whether I'm a minister, an elder, a member, a kid in my congregation, I'm just as responsible for that as the person we end up sending. So the idea is, when our service is incomplete, we need help to fulfill our obligations. Our obligations I would see as twofold as a church. The pastoring the flock. The Lord Jesus said, go out and train and baptize. That's the Great Commission. Well, there are those who are trained and baptized that need to be cared for. That's first part of our responsibility. I'd say that's primary in sense of logical order. You need to have a church that goes out. So first the church, and then the second, those who are being trained and baptized. So there's a twofold aspect to our service, and as churches we are incomplete in our service until we have both operating at the same time, the strengthening of our churches and the outreach. Now, if we only have resources, we have 2 elders, and we have, say, 80 people, your focus is going to be on pastoring the congregation, making sure they're fed, making sure the sheep that Christ has bought with his blood are fed, and you pour yourself out over that sacrificial offering, like we read in Philippians, for that care. That's certainly a priority, but that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for the Great Commission around it. It just means right now all we can do is what God has given us, this congregation, and I just picked a number of 80. So we need help. If I need an elder in my congregation to help in the work, then that's everybody's responsibility. I can preach, we need an elder, and every one of us is responsible for that elder, but only one person can serve as an elder. So that's the idea as an assumption behind this idea of cooperative mission approaches, which isn't an idea that I'm proposing. It's a reality I'm trying to expose or uncover or point to. The other, so this has already been stated, the members of one body are obligated to help one another in their service. You can think of that in the local church. You can think of that in the federation. Think of that globally. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about cooperative mission approaches. So I think as young men growing up, as churches, church leaders, we need to think of the world as the goal of our work, and then we look for holes. We look for the holes in our responsibility, and then we work to fill those holes. So generally, how it works is we work geographically to find the cracks, if I could use that, the holes, where the work needs to be done. We think in terms of geography, geographical areas, and then we give first responsibility to those who are nearest. So example, in a church, the person who's the most proximate in his gifts or has the best opportunity is probably the person you'll want to choose to fill a position in your local church. The same in the global scene. The one who is closest gets priority. I think we as churches don't do that enough. I don't think we as Canadian Reformed churches do that enough. And United Reformed, I don't put Reformed churches. That idea of the global scene, looking for the holes and saying, okay, what's next? And you could do that in Ontario, in your province, wherever you live. Just look, and if you think that way, it will also be encouraging to know what we need, and you have a needs list that's much closer to reality. And then you see what you're responsible for. So I'm in Edmonton. That's in Alberta, second province over. And there's some churches in the middle, or south, in the middle, in the north, but there's actually a lot of communities around there. Who knew, right? But there's some communities with people in them that aren't hearing Reformed preaching, and they don't have access, maybe online. Well, that's my responsibility. I'm failing that in my area as a believer. So I want to have that thought pattern behind that. So I've already stated this. Sorry about that. So first, responsibility for their own geographical regions. I think that locally in our federation, but also globally. And the point being here now is we want to avoid repetition. So we're thinking, okay, here's the holes. How do we look at it? Let's all cooperate together. We're all Christians. And then we have to go needs-based cooperation. So when I was in Smithers, we had a pipe organ. It was a real nice pipe organ and lovely sound. But then it needed some repairs, and then they came up with, I guess, Rogers. I'm not a pipe organ man. I'm talking in front of Dr. Van Vliet about pipe organs. I can't even strum a guitar. But what I thought was neat is you could enhance your pipe organ electronically, and you could push a button, and it sounded like it was a recording of those huge pipes in Holland that they could add on that would never fit in our building, but you could have the same sound. So you don't have to replace all the pipes. It just enhanced it. It was complementary. That's the picture that I think we need to have when we look at cooperative missions. We respect what's there. We love it. It's beautiful, and it's the best. It's better than the electronic to have the real pipes. Then we add on to that as much as we can based on need. So we add on. We don't repeat pipes. We just add on to it. I think the illustration is clear. Now, the questions that were given to me, sorry, I didn't even present that, but it's cooperative missions approach, and then some of the questions that were, how do you help a young federation? How do we come alongside them and be useful? I have all the questions here, but the idea is now we have this big global vision, and now there's an area, and there's a federation there, a young federation in a big area. Now, I'm going to speak of my experience, so I'm thinking of the Reformed Churches of Brazil, the IRB. Brazil's a very large country, 200 million at least, probably growing by the year. And so it's a large country, and then it's a very small federation, often referred to as a young federation because it's the result of many years of mission work. So the question is, how do we come alongside, cooperate with a young federation without hindering their own growth and development and responsibility? The question assumes an understanding of what a young federation is, and I'd like to highlight the point that it's very difficult to define what a young federation is. Like if you think of the Canadian Reformed churches, what do we got? 68 years max, right? For as a federation, I don't even know the exact date, but let's say 65 years as a federation in Canada. Brazil, if you just compare there, they're about 18 years. So the difference is not very much, relatively speaking. So age isn't going to be a big indication of young or mature or immature. And so I'd like to suggest that besides age, when we look at a federation, when we decide what its situation is, when we try to understand where it's at, we need to look at the depth of knowledge per capita, if I could say it, per congregation, per member. This is an idea of the flow of knowledge. When I'm brought up in this congregation, how much general understanding of the Reformed faith, of the biblical faith, exists in this congregation? Is it a lot? Am I guaranteed to see it everywhere? Does it breathe out of the people, out of everything that's said, how they do their work? Or is it something that's still being taught with words, but very few examples? You can compare a 10-year-old whose dad is an elder, or his uncle is an elder, or his grandpa was an elder, and family gatherings are very settled and permeated with principles in what I call inherited practices that represent Reformed practice, Reformed doctrines. The idea that you don't work on a Sunday, for example, so you have soup that you can prepare the day before. We all giggle and think, well, that's such a Dutch thing. I'd question that. We would recommend that. Why don't you make something you can do on Saturday so that you can actually rest on Sunday and your maid doesn't need to work and whatever. There's more to it. And that's those ingrained things that we cannot start despising, we should look at carefully, are also part of the culture that's missing. So that's part of Young Federation. You don't have a lot of that. It's very low amount of inherited practices. The idea that God sees all. I think you guys have to read the book by Mango Wadi. Is that right? That book where he compares the Dutch to his land, where they could just put out fruit and say, put your $20 in when you grab your fruit. And he said, well, it would never work in 90% of the world. It's because it's got reformed. And he actually quotes the Heidelberg Catechism on those pages. So this is what these people are brought up with. No wonder. So that's the thinking I'm trying to point to, that ingrained Christianity that we don't even understand for ourselves. And then financial stability and opportunity is another consideration when we talk about Young Federation. Young would be less financial stability and opportunity, because you think it's, you can live on less. But now you're an elder and you got a city of 3.5 million people. It's a huge city, and you don't have, you maybe can't afford a car, and if you have a car, you might not be able to afford gas. Or if you afford the gas, it's like the whole congregation has to contribute to it, so you have to use it very, very carefully. Your opportunity go way down. The possibility of pastoring your congregation, just the hours and hours you need to work, but then the hours it takes to travel across the city. So financial stability is a factor that we have to understand when we talk about Young Federation. So not age. In fact, age is one of the least, to me, in my mind, it's not really the key thing here. If we just look at age, then like a federation like the one in Brazil should be way further along in that sense. So there's more factors that we have to understand. What do we mean by maturity? Again, the idea is that churches should be growing to maturity, right? That's our goal. That's our goal as a local church. That's our goal as a federation. And so again, I just highlight maturity is shown by the percentage of giving members, and giving isn't financially giving, but I mean able to be, I'll give you examples there. There's stability in their homes. For example, personal Bible study and growth, that you have a high percentage of that. That's a sign of good maturity in a congregation, that there's Matthew 18 is being applied. That's a sign of maturity in churches. Matthew 18, exhorting one another and encouraging one another. Men who are capable of serving in the office is also a good indication of stability and maturity. So that general understanding of Christian faith, probably Christian schools. If you look at a situation when you talk about a young federation or a maturing federation, or even maybe, let's say, immature in the sense of young, you might have, of your congregation, let's go with the number of 100, you might have 1 or 2 men that are capable of serving well in the office. In a good situation, after a few years, maybe 5. And then your cases where you actually have to deal with special cases, instead of having in one of our churches probably, let's say 5 to 10% that congregation that really need regular pastoral care to an extent where you're exhorting regularly on a visit rather than celebrating, you're up at 50 to 70%. So you have less capable leaders, but you have way higher number of special cases, and that takes a toll. So here you have 2 established churches, one in Canada, one in, I'll just use an example of Brazil. They have all the trappings of a church. They do. They are the church. Christ Jesus is the head. He's working, he's leading, he's guiding, he's pastoring his flock. But they're not in a similar situation. And I think when we talk about maturity, we have to understand that difference. Another difference that you notice is the experience and the certainty of the assembly. So even the office bearers are fairly new. And again, it's not a question of time of service. Most of the office bearers, for example, in Brazil, have served more time than I have in office when I was there. So again, it's not an amount of years, but it's the experience of having seen things worked out in a practical way. So understanding the gospel message, but not as it looks like in the practical life of work and family. So when you go on a visit, your expectations, you're not 100% sure on what you should be expecting. You might have some principles, so there will be more cases of an office bearer, insisting, not in the IRB, not in the Reformed churches, but in a young, where an office bearer might say, you know what, I've been reading Corinthians, it says women wear veils. Do you wear a veil? You should really be wearing a veil, and really, let's say, highlighting that point and pushing that point, that would be a sign of immaturity and a lack of certainty, reading and reacting, more impulsive type behavior. Now, that's not the Reformed churches in Brazil as a whole, but it's a sign that you can see, and it will appear more often among assemblies, so groups of men agreeing on this type of this focus. So history lessons can be known, but book knowledge doesn't compare with a sense of proper application, sense of moderation, context, pitfalls. Consistency of decisions is always a difficulty because there's not a lot of certainty, so you go one way and you go the other way. So that's a sign of maturity. That's where there's going to be a difference, and that's always growing. Infrastructure also is a sign of maturity. Infrastructure that's focused on continuation and not on surviving. That's a huge understanding. So it's good enough to find some men to quickly take care of your congregation, but maturity has having men and training the next already, looking ahead to what needs to be done. That's a sign of maturity. And then also immaturity and maturity is related to dependence on other churches. A young or an immature church, so I'm using that in the sense of establishing, can be very old in terms of years of existence, but continually dependent for human and our financial resources. Human being people able, giving people, not money giving, but able to lead a Bible study, to run a committee on psalms or hymns, or be a preacher, be an elder, be a deacon. So I'm trying to have the big view of giving here, of service in the churches. Independence is characterized by the ability to carry out the mission of the church without further assistance at all. The big mission, the caring for the congregation, and the second part, outreach. The two together. I always keep that too. The Great Commission has an aspect of being holy and then shining as a light. The Canadian Reformed churches actually are not completely independent. We rely on foreigners for the work of theological education. Dr. DeVisser is a good example of that. We have for many, many years. Also for mission. Missionaries we have to grab from other countries because we don't have enough men. Let's face it, we're dependent. We're not completely independent, which is not a bad thing. I think it's good to have that cooperative mission, but I just want to make sure our notch, we're not thinking we got it all figured out. Let's knock ourselves down many notches in that sense. So the next question then, if the goal is, the question is how do we cooperate together and work together, then I ask the question, well, how important is maturity? So we want growth and maturity, but how important is it? Is it a deal breaker? And I'd say maturity isn't the first step of mission. The first step of mission is preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. The first step of mission is having people who are giving their lives to that, who believe it, even though they're tripping and falling. The first step of mission is to have the church of Jesus Christ celebrating the gospel, rejoicing in grace, planting churches so that they can plant churches. So you can do a lot of work without being at this level of maturity. It's not necessary. You don't need to have this independence to be a functioning federation. You don't need to have a sufficient amount of training program to be a functioning federation. So just to keep things in perspective, young federations are sometimes compared to the teenagers of the ecclesiastical world. As we see that we're in relationships with churches with federations that are functioning but are not mature in the sense that I just described it. Okay, mature, nothing to do with spiritual capabilities. We're talking about a whole, the work of a federation as a whole. So they're younger, or there's room for growth. And we have fellowship with churches that have less financial stability. They have fewer office bearers. They have higher per needs or needs per capita ratings. And they're just as much called to mission as we are. They are representing the work of Christ in a particular area with that full burden of responsibility. And I'd like to highlight that they look like us, like an adult. My boys, I have 15-year-old boys, they're almost taller than me now, and they're bigger. They're just as big. They're actually faster at everything than I am. They're better at everything than I am. And it's real humble pie here. It's great, right? I used to show them. I taught them everything they knew, and now they're teaching me all the new moves, soccer, everything. Anyway, so the point is, teenagers are fully capable and increasingly responsible. They're understanding this responsibility. What they lack is where I, as a father, have a role. So that's the understanding that there is still something missing among them. I wouldn't just throw them into office as an office bearer right away. Yet they love the Lord and they'll give their lives for Him at the same time. So I think what we need to understand is that the burden of responsibility is still theirs as a federation, a young federation, and they know this responsibility. It's not something that we have to say, hey, just want to tell you, you need to learn to take responsibility. That's not the point. They know they have the responsibility because they are a federation. We're at that stage already. And so we'll see that the federation, young federation, is churches in communion that understand very well what they are responsible for us, but like the Canadian Reformed churches, unable to fully fulfill this responsibility due to their limitations. And it's true that when we cooperate now, we're looking for needs, and we don't want to impede anything that young federations are able to do. We got to go back to that pipe organ picture. But I think it's very clear to see that we're working with a level of maturity that's gone beyond the base level. We have churches, we have ordained office bearers who receive their calling from the Lord. So when we talk about young federations and teenagers of the ecclesiastical world, we understand that they understand their calling and responsibility. We don't have to teach that. We don't have to help them in that sense. And cooperation is focused on equipping the saints for the work of service. That's Ephesians 4. Like you do locally, I think we need to do the same on the global level. Then we talk about your task as a missionary in a young federation. It's ever-changing, so that's obvious in a mission situation, but it's an obvious point that I want to highlight because it has consequences for what we think about cooperative mission approach. So you have your form for ordination, you have a description of mission given in the church order, you go out planting churches, training people. So in the beginning, the work is like a doctor standing beside a baby being born, if you can use that as an expression. The doctor's there, there's guidance. It's the work of God that you get to be a part of. And babies are born. I don't know if any of you have had the privilege of seeing that miracle. It's an amazing thing. I've seen many sights in the world, and you travel around, you see mountains and waters and waterfalls, and then you see a baby born, and your tears come to the eye. You can't believe this is possible. But that's what it is, mission too. You see the church in its birth, but it's messy, right? There's lots of blood, and it's not a clean, hygienic. It's not like picking up milk from the grocery store. It's not. It's quite a bit different. So that idea of the messiness is part of things being born. The same with church and mission, and so there's a changing focus. Bringing a child, and then there's years and years of training, teaching, guiding, discipling that is a part of this giving birth of churches, and from there you have a federation formed. So I want just to highlight this development, and as the steps are taken toward a cooperative approach, this training includes essential biblical and confessional aspects of church governance, attention to future leadership needs, and ecclesiastical relationships. The point is, the learning, the training in what it means to be a federation is a part of the preparation stages as you get to the point of a federation. So the churches, as they come out, if you say, okay, this is an established church, that church understands by its character, because it is the church of Jesus Christ, it understands that they have a responsibility to care for the sheep that Christ bought with his blood, and to share the gospel with the neighbors around. That's a part of the essence of being a church. You haven't planted a church if you haven't put in those principles. The idea of paying attention to future leadership needs. That's a part. It's just what it means to be a church. Ecclesiastical relationships, and you know, I'm sure, how many texts we could put behind these little principles I'm popping up on the screen just to get that sense. So now we're thinking after the church order is determined, right? That's young federation. Church order has been determined. Now the training includes walking beside ordained leaders in the application of principles to real life situations. Now some missionary participation is an accompaniment by invitation and or appointment. So there's a change in the relationship as a church has a church order determined. Now now the missionary is not the church order. The church order is the church order, and a missionary submits to that in the cooperation with another federation. So you'll work as counselors at a general synod, committee members, active church members. You'll organize the Sunday lunch or whatever just as part of that congregation. That's the thinking. Church visitors as cooperation, church planters as missionaries, professors, and I'll show you a little bit more about that part. The general point I'm trying to make here is in cooperative mission approaches, we're talking with a federation, so it's a specific point, but it's a point along the way. From birth to, we're on the way too, as Canadian Reformed churches. We got a lot of work to do. So from parent to partner, there's no defined lines. There's milestones, but there's no defined lines where you say, okay, now you're good. Everything's changed all of a sudden because you're a federation. Example of the Canadian Reformed churches, it didn't mean that, okay, we're Canadian Reformed Churches Federation, poof, we have a working theological college, just like that. Everything it doesn't happen. It's growth, it's development. It's an obvious statement, but it's often missed when we now look at federations in other places, and whether it's Brazil or anywhere else. So missionaries and recently declared sister churches need to be honest about the reality of the situation. They just need to describe what the real situation is and realize that it's not patronizing to call a church what it is as it is becoming increasingly mature. It's not patronizing to say that's young or that there's a level of immaturity there. The trick is not to deny the real situation of teenager while at the same time not holding them in that stage by making it a permanent label. Now they have to fit in that, and you will always be a teenager. Try say that to your son, your teenage son. That's not going to work. And he's going to prove it to you by showing all of a sudden he's better than everything at you anyways, and you're actually thankful there's another generation after, because the world can only improve according to my teenagers. So it's not right to keep giving milk when they need solid food. That's very biblical. And I think then when we talk about help, that's the thinking here. Okay, it has to be cooperation is humility. It's personal contributions, and we have to think that helping means looking for those needs and just coming alongside and looking then what's young federations, what is lacking. Federation of Churches is spiritually capable church leaders who understand their twofold responsibility in a given geographical region. They understand, yet there's problems. There's logistical capabilities, or incapabilities, I guess. And sometimes the logistical incapability, the inability to even do a part of their responsibility, even care for themselves, what it does is that it even affects vision. If you're so busy just caring for your own family, you have a little bit of trouble seeing other needs in your own congregation. So that idea of having limited time, abilities, people available, doesn't mean that people available who are working are incapable or lacking anything, but it means their focus is according to primary needs first. As a result, even these logistical capabilities, a lack of personnel, a lack of financial resources, hinders the ability to even visualize the breadth of the need. Okay, maybe that's why we haven't looked around to all our other provinces and seen the holes, because we're not able to see the breadth of the need because we're so focused on our own situation here in Canada, but put that in any country. And now when we think of that cooperatively, what we have to do is we have to step back and we have to take a look at it in a broader way. So I would think that sister church relations and federation strengthening, those are some terms we use sometimes to quickly define what missionaries are doing in other countries. They're only a part of, and I'm speaking in a Canadian Reformed seminary here, so I put Canadian Reformed Church responsibility in the world. Strength, we have to help one another, that's for sure. But it's only a part if we have the broader cooperative mission view. So I would say our shared responsibility extends to the unreached areas, and the existence of a federation in an area only changes how we carry out our mandate. So here's a federation. They're responsible for a huge geographical area. I'm responsible for that whole geographical area. Okay, so let's use Brazil, example. The ICRC, when they divided up the regional districts for missions and their missions committee, they assigned to Brazil Latin and South America. So we just use that as a geographical region. The region is huge. It includes Mexico. It includes all of Brazil. It includes all the countries in South America. It's huge. It's a huge region, but really that's where the responsibility is of all of us to that area. And then the federation has first dibs, if I could put it, first right. But their limitations there are great because of their size and what we've just talked about. So we as sister churches see that as our area. And we have to respect the church, the pipes, if I could put it that way, that are there. The idea that, okay, there's a federation in Brazil, it's done, is as ridiculous and silly as thinking, well, there's 5 churches in Spain, so we've got in Europe. Just purely in numbers and geographical area. It's a crazy way of thinking, so we shouldn't get into that trap. I think sometimes we say that in our bouts of laziness. We're like, oh man, it's so much work, we've got enough going on, why do we keep working out? Well, because we've lost the global picture. And so I think that idea is when we talk about shared responsibility, we need to take responsibility for that. If the federation has first right, but they're unable to do that, we strengthen them as much as we can. That's the often best tool. But there's still limitations, even if you're spending time strengthening. And so then we have to look at other ways to cooperate together. I think missionaries have mandate and calling to move beyond the federation in their work. I think that's the best way to serve as a sister church, to help a federation as much as you can in the work, give them as many arms and fingers as possible, but not but at the same time, having the need and the opportunity to work beyond a federation in a local area. So partnership includes vision sharing, offers, and constantly shifting, handing over responsibility. So it's a working relationship where we see the big picture, we recognize, respect, and help as much as we can the sister churches that are nearest, and then we say, hey, did you know that there's a lot of opportunities in Peru because there's this conference here, and we're interested in supporting you in your work by reaching out to that. What do you say to that? That's an offer. And if it's no, that doesn't mean you have to stop. You say, okay, well, we'll do it without your blessing, because it's still our responsibility. So then there's a growth and a learning. Okay, I'm going to move on just because of the time. Equal partners, and I question that. The assumption is if there's two federations, they are equal partners. I say that doesn't exist in a family, it doesn't exist in a marriage, it doesn't exist in a church, because the term equal, you can load it up either way you want. So equal in some senses, for sure, before the Lord, in terms of capable, for sure, doing good work as individuals. Paul talks about mutual encouragement. So if Paul can have mutual encouragement in chapter 1 of Romans from visiting a church, well, then with his church, well, then we all can have mutual encouragement. So there's an equality that's for sure a part of it. I would rather say that when we say that we're equal partners before God, that means we fully trust the other federation and the work that they are doing. I would say I'm an equal partner, and just to use an example, just a local one, I'm a pastor, a minister, preacher, and there's deacons. Well, we're equal partners and in the sense that I fully trust what the deacons do, but there's going to be different capabilities and gifts involved. So equal doesn't mean equal in ability. Lesson number 1, the forming of a federation doesn't make a group of churches necessarily equal in capabilities, equal to every other group of churches that calls itself a federation. I like that Philippians 2, Paul talking about Paul, the great apostle, great in the sense of did a lot of work, poured himself out and just said, I'm going to work till I die, pouring myself, no problem. And then he sends back Epaphroditus, who's just distressed beyond his capabilities. So, and he allows him to stop doing his service in Rome based on very practical questions of health. So Paul was going to pour himself out, but he didn't expect Epaphroditus to do it. Epaphroditus had a different job. He delivered money, and he was there to visit an apostle in prison. Totally different. He says he's a fellow soldier. He's a fellow worker. He's a brother. That's equality that I think we need to think about in terms of federations as well. It's not it's an idea of fellow soldiers, but not necessarily equal soldiers. And what we've learned is that big problems happen if you just use the rhetoric. If you just use the talk, you ignore the realities. You say, well, it's an equal federation, and they're just like us, and then therefore we have to do everything the same, and we can expect the same things. This is not helpful. It's a federation. Get all your missionaries out of the field. Right? Equal. Aren't we equal? Why should we be there? Isn't that patronizing? That's a very... it's a problematic viewpoint. That's what we've learned over time. I could give examples, but I'm recognizing a little bit of time restraints here. So then I just want to highlight here the premature federation to federation communication can exclude large parts of the whole picture. So there's a helpful role of missionaries that continues even in the midst of immature federations. They have many blessings that they're able to contribute. They have familiarity with working system. They have an historical perspective. Like, actually, it's interesting in the Federation of Reformed Churches in Brazil, due to the fact that I had read and prepped for many years ahead of time. My father was a missionary there too, which helped. And then when you do your work, you see all the churches at the same time, and you're working in that federation. As a missionary, we actually had an understanding of the very federation we were working with that was equal to or surpassed many of the actual leaders at their synods, just because that historical perspective gave a different perspective. Okay, I just want to highlight that. There's nothing, that's just how it goes. That's just how it's developed. International perspective and the time, that's what you're devoted to. You're devoted to big vision questions, not to visiting Dona Maria on Thursday to help her as she struggles with her son in school and she doesn't know what passage to read to him. So there's a difference in time. Okay, so it's the same as here. Professors here are able to devote themselves to that, whereas a minister in a local congregation has a different time and also then, as a result, a different perspective. Okay, so I'd like to highlight that unequal financial capabilities. Let's face it, they're not equal partners financially, but it doesn't mean giving churches have higher spiritual authority. A lesson we've learned is that because I'm able to be the giving church now, or federation, then I say, okay, well, you want theological education? Give me your plan. So God's ordained servants in a young federation receive the authority from Jesus Christ to lead and guide their church. They come together, they meet, they prepare a plan, they approve the plan as churches, as God's people in another country. They present it to the giving church to see if they'll support it. And the giving church, which often has a committee with non-ordained members, they'll say, well, we don't, do you really need this? Do you need this? Do you need that? That's a very, very bad way of cooperating, because now you've taken spiritual authority on what a church decides. So I say, just say, you know what? We're not interested in this plan. That's what you have the right. You have the right to offer, and they have the right to accept or reject. We have the right to ask as young federation, and the other church has the right to say yes or no, we're interested or we're not. And if they say not interested, you go, oh, what was the problem with it? It changes the whole scenario. So we learned that equal partners, we're not equal partners in the sense that federations aren't, but there are benefits also of not being exactly the same. We focus on biblical principles we share that are based on confessions and church order. You really highlight what we're doing. What are the churches? What's our calling? What's our responsibility? And also we learn through investigation of different applications. So there's a lot of sharing and importing ideas. So the point is, we often celebrate that we're not equal partners. I often celebrate with my wife that we're not exactly the same. That's a fantastic thing. I get new perspective. That's great. I'm equal before God, but we're not exactly the same. Same thing with federations. And then we celebrate that. This is how we celebrate it. Look at all these wonderful things we see. We're able to grow. But then we have to be consistent and recognize that there's not equality. We're not all equipped in the same way for everything in every situation when it comes down to expectations and what we help and how we do work together. So what has worked well? It's trusting the on-the-ground agents as they develop relationships, gauge real needs. Financial investment in supplying personnel with tools. The best way to help, I think, is giving people and then giving them the tools to do their work. So if it's going to be theological education, say here's some theological education organizers and the tools. They need a place to work or whatever it is. And then also, this is, I guess, a on-the-ground example, cooperating with Federation of Sister Church in the broader context of the Great Commission for their geographical region. That's the goal, I think. So when you say, let's help the IRB with theological education, we as sister churches have to see that as a small federation in this area that's much larger than what the federation is covering. And so we say, well, we're interested in that for sure, but we have a responsibility that's much broader than just your federation. So we'd like to aim to that, since we're there anyways, and then we can both benefit. So theological education for the world, federation benefits. I put Cleary, that's a reading room that was in downtown Recife. Didn't know how much time I had, but it's just an outreach post in a city. The goal of that was for the country, and the benefit of that, of course, is celebrated by the federation. For example, the congregation in Recife, 75% came through that reading room, which was a broader outreach. It wasn't focused on the federation. It was focused on the global, national, international vision of that area. But so the ideal of cooperation is that both are served, but we don't forget our own responsibility, and our cooperation with the federation serves that purpose. And then another example would be church planting, but I'll have to leave that for now. So just some of the conclusions, and this is a mindset that young and mature is not a disparaging comment. Today in our fear of being always politically correct and never offending anyone, I'll defend that it's not offensive. to say you're young or immature, as long as you recognize your own level where you are on that picture as well. But it means that they have responsibility. We recognize that, but so do we. And that's why we need to cooperate. Equal partner rhetoric often fails to recognize the different capabilities and gifts of the body of Christ and can result in politics, change that a bit, result in pressure to perform at a level that doesn't match the reality of the work. So sometimes our language has a result that we're just creating this thing that looks good on paper, but it's not real. And when you start getting caught up in the paper and not in the reality, then it's just it's endless headaches. It's not good cooperation. So remember that, okay? There's paper, but there's growth. So the paper, you know, my kid is an adult at well, I don't even know when, soon, I guess. Those two big boys. But it's still gonna. It's not, doesn't mean there's an instant change. So I'm an adult. They're an adult. They're going to get into the same area, but there's still going to be a difference. And that's what I really want to highlight. And I'm not going to expect them to. Well, we don't expect them to take office when they're 20. Just it doesn't fit. But they're an adult. Yep. Professing member. Yep. Right. But we know there's more behind that. So why don't we do the same on our international relationships? Cooperative missions approaches will start with the full picture of responsibility shared by the Catholic Church, respect and support existing labors in a particular area, and aim at filling in the holes. I think that's really what it all comes down to, and that's the way that it'll work best.